Sandra Stoica, talking about the invisible city where place meets authenticity. I think it is not necessary to present to Sandra in the way you meant her before.
Well, I have to say there were lots of concepts bounced about, starting with the preparations for the conference and yesterday and this morning even more. Authenticity, values, tangible, intangible, and instead of trying to clarify any of them, I'm going to throw another one in the pot, which is place, the notion of place. And I would quite like to start with a quote, which for me kind of reflects very poetically, but truthfully, our very complex relationship with our own built environment. Italo Calvino says that with cities, it is as with dreams. Everything imaginable can be dreamed, but even the most unexpected dream is a rebus that conceals a desire, or its reverse, a fear. Cities, like dreams, are made of desires and fears, even if the thread of their discourse is secret. Their rules are absurd. Their perspectives are deceitful, and everything conceals something else. Sounds a bit ominous. But it is this kind of, relationship with our own built environment, with what we call place, which is quite different from a more abstract notion of space. And I'm going to try to explain a bit what I mean by that, and also what others meant by that before. The concept of place is very pervasive within the urban conservation discourse. But what is not so obvious is really how that is used now in its whole range of meanings, as in the writings of the philosophers of the antiquity. Edward Casey, who has traced the history of the concept of place in philosophy from antiquity to nowadays, has shown its assimilation to space in medieval theology, its understanding in early modern physics as a particular manifestation of space, the site for building, and how the temporocentrism that dominated the 18th and 19th centuries reduced place to locations between which movements of physical bodies occur. The mental image of the urban space observes several levels of interpretation of space, from Plato and Aristotle to Kant, Einstein, and Norbert Schulz's 6 levels of spatial concepts. For Plato, geometry is the science of space, while Aristotle reckons space as the sum of all places, a dynamic field with directions and qualitative properties. Furthermore, Kant considers space as a basic category for the a priori human understanding. Einstein opposed to the homogeneous Euclidean space as space in which direction and geometry is a straightforward result of human perception and not at all natural. This is the break between the concrete and physical space and the abstract mathematical one. But I think for us, the most relevant definition of what place is Christian Norbert Schulz, who kind of looks at 6 levels of spatial concepts from the very early pragmatic space of physical action to a perceptive space of instant orientation, to an existential space which gives the image of the environment. A fourth understanding would be a cognitive space of the physical world. Even further, more kind of delving into the meaning of space, the abstract space of logical relationships, which has the capacity of describing all the previous ones, and kind of almost dominating all the others, and especially for us in the professions of architecture and conservation, the artistic or expressive space created by artists, architects, and urbanists. While before there were 2 major spatial theories, one concerned with a Euclidean abstract geometrical space which omits the subject, and the other with the human psychological perception of space, which puts the subject at the center of it, Norbert Schulz approached urban space as an essential space, by taking into consideration both its geometrical and also human dimensions at the same time. The urban structure is primarily determined by human activity, and at this level, we have the place that confers identity to humans. It is very important to acknowledge that the urban environment is far from being merely an extension of the home, and from there, the urban space one of the personal space. One needs to emphasize the role of the public space as opposed to the private home in structuring urban environment. Both Ortega y Gasset and Heidegger insist on the intrinsicalness of boundaries for the definition of space. To quote Heidegger, what the word space, Raum, designates, it's said by its ancient meaning. Raum means a place cleared or freed for settlement and lodging. Space is in essence that for which room has been made, that which is let into its bounds. So this twofold concept of the boundary, the limiting space from inside and at the same time from outside, was and still is essential for the city, although the reasons have changed indeed over time. It is not anymore defense of the inside from people from elsewhere, but the defense of the outside environment from people from inside more and more. But besides this material, concrete interpretation of the boundary, there is also a symbolic one that marks the difference between order and chaos, or between civitas and savageness, which is the reason for which Romulus killed Remus when leaping over his new boundary around the Palatine Hill after ridiculing and obstructing the works, as Umberto Eco puts it in his discussion of rational and irrational. Even if at the more formal level, Camilo Sita already defended the idea that boundaries in the urban texture are not only essential but also a priori. In his essay La Rebelión de las Masas, when discussing the broader program of the implications of who rules the world for the structuring of the society and its cities, and indeed its cities, José Ortega y Gasset ascertains the formation of the Greco-Roman city-state, epitomizes the principle of the state as a genuine creation in which the equilibrium between the internal and the external is lost, with the latter taking over. You might be exaggerating when saying that the urbs or the polis starts by being an empty space. The forum, the agora, and all the rest is just a means of fixing that empty space, of limiting its outlines. Nevertheless, this subsumes the importance of that empty space for the urban environment. One more reason, perhaps, for urban conservation being concerned with the more complex structures and relationships within the urban environment, rather than merely its separate elements, be they houses, ensembles, streets, or even conservation areas, if isolated from the entirety of the urban organism. Ortega y Gasset stresses here that the very substance of this synosis, emphasizing the invention through it of a purely human space, clearly delimited from nature and therefore characterized by an abstract socio-political dimension. He says the polis is not primarily a collection of habitable dwellings, but a meeting place for citizens, a space set apart for public functions. Observe that this signifies nothing less than the invention of a new kind of space, much more new than the space of Einstein. This points out that the values of the urban environment should be sought out also elsewhere rather than solely in purely physical qualities. It has intangible values intrinsic to the city as tangible manifestation of the synosis. In this way, urban space is defined as existential space in which human existence takes place and forms its own identity. Humans shape the urban space, while this in return shapes human existence. The authenticity of an existential space is inherently a dynamic process. This process results in the construction of a mental image of the urban space and its limits, able to confer multiple meanings and allowing for interpretation at many different levels of understanding. This means the very concept of urban space has existential roots, its authenticity being basically defined by its orientation and contained human actions. In this sense, the urban space is ultimately described by the Platonic concept of chora. Plato distinguishes notions of space between chora and topos. Timaeus, who accounts for the creation of the cosmos by the divine craftsman, says one needs three basic principles to explain the cosmos, the world order. These are being, becoming, which is both in actuality and also potentiality, and the third element is a receptacle for coming into being, like a dynamic notion, this space, Cora. By being partly or temporally occupied space, Cora emphasizes the notion of possibility, a reality between the absolute of the universal ideas and the concrete of the substance. It is an enabler, and it is the possibility of becoming. As Alberto Perez Gomez puts it in his interpretation of the Platonic meaning in Timaeus, Cora is the mimetic receptacle for truly human action, as opposed to animalized behavior, and yet reducible to neither natural substances nor universal ideas. To him, this understanding makes Cora the realm of language and art, the cultural reality, whose essence it is its incredible diversity for what it is, a unique biological species, which we are. In this way, the Platonic concept of Cora best describes urban space, which is not simply a place or matter, but a receptacle, a medium, a possibility. It is not limited to topos, but allows a process of becoming to take place. It is not finite matter in with a crystallized structure and defined form, but rather something much more than this. The potentiality and dynamicity implied by the term Cora are exactly those qualities that differentiate the living urban space, where urbanity is naturally manifest from inert, rigid, it differentiates from inert, rigid planned environment, within which, if urbanity takes place, is more often despite rather than due to urban planning and design. Settlements are the result of a long constituting and developing process, whether they are spontaneous or planned. The genesis and subsequent development of cities has sparked much discussion between urban historians and geographers interested in finding a suitable typology. A common distinction is made between spontaneous, organically developed cities and planned, designed ones. However, people like Spiro Kostov, they denounced this typology as misleading and superficial, since an element of deliberate planning is intrinsic to both types, even if in different proportion. For example, the much debated situation of Edinburgh Old Town, which is sometimes presented as an organically developed town, in fact, much of its actual structure owes to the layout from the 20th century during King David I. The extension of designed versus vernacular urban environment has no meaning from the point of view of the architectural historian. Both types of intervention are the result of central cultural and political circumstances. And this is also true from an urban conservation point of view, insofar that the aim of conservation is in both cases to retain the authenticity of those elements and characteristics of the urban texture that contribute to and are important for the formation of a community's identity. The misconception that the planned environment has to be conserved in a state as close as possible to its original concept as a measure of authenticity is nevertheless quite widespread and originates with the art and architectural conservation philosophies which protect the authenticity and integrity of the original work of art or architecture as conceived by its author. But the nature of the urban environment is fundamentally different, and while it is of course important that the original concept is properly recorded and studied, the aim of conservation is not geared simply towards the originally planned or designed environment, but equally towards all those elements and characteristics, however alien to the original concept, that were grafted onto the planned environment by the community inhabiting it. It is important to note here that we are speaking of an original concept rather than an original work, because in the vast majority of cases, the appropriation of the environment by its inhabiting community started even before an area was fully built, as planned, and therefore has never materialized as originally planned or designed. Again, a very close example to us, the Edinburgh New Town, where the intended hierarchy and form from Craig's plan was immediately perverted as soon as the building of the New Town started, with developer sneaking in tenements that look like terrace houses and so on, and changing the entire hierarchy of the street pattern. The term urban heritage was coined by Gustavo Giovannoni at the beginning of the 20th century to define urban fabric as a sui generis entity and not as the sum of its independent monuments, which was the understanding of the historic city in his time and still is today to a great extent. This idea was truly innovative, and one could say it came before its time, and it has proved to have little influence on the development of conservation at the beginning of the 20th century out in Italy. And it was only at the end of the century that urbanism and politics have become ripe enough to assimilate it, at least on a theoretical level, since a lot of the practice still leaves a lot to be wished for in this field. The reason for this may seem elusive, but it is probably exactly that lack of conceptual research that we are very well aware of in urban conservation, because we are so much involved in the technological advancement of conservation yes. Hence, an archivist model still prevails in our society's views of urban heritage. Within this, the town is metaphorically assimilated with an archive. Its buildings, streets, symbolic places are individually regarded as charters about our history and our culture. The concept of archive, based on the idea of authenticity, was firstly theorized by Camillo Boito, and it necessarily implies a certain curating through the identification, selection, and preservation of the material as close as possible to its authentic form, although comprising successive stages. But while this approach might work at the level of individual monuments, it does not really lend itself to be instrumental at an urban scale, where the historic town is essentially characterized by its permanent reuse, adaptation, and even destruction to make room for the new, or a much more extensive, on a much more extensive time scale as well. Hence, in this context, authenticity has to be understood in a much more dynamic way. The form, structure, and modus operandi of the historic urban areas are inextricably linked between them. The urban context mirrors, therefore, the essence and dynamics of the changes in the society. Traditionally, architecture and urban history have built up their own canons for judging architecture and urbanism, but these also were subject to change over time. This explaining sometimes wildly differing attitudes towards the historic urban fabric. While in use, however, these canons represented the authoritative way of identifying the values of the historic and contemporary urban fabric. In this respect, authenticity is a value judgment. So the way in which changes in the society have an impact onto the urban fabric can be seen in particular in its changing value judgments. In philosophy, a key issue of axiology is the rational status of these value judgments. This displays three key positions: one in which value judgments are absolute or objective, on the basis of either divine or some kind of authority, either standards that rationally or otherwise transcend human decision or divine authority. Another position is that value judgments are relative social constructs or conventions, and consequently their relevance is limited, specific. And yet another position considers value judgments completely subjective, non-rational expressions of personal preference, and therefore of no more than personal relevance. It is important to note that, in fact, these categories only exist through each other. Leaving aside the third position, which is unsuitable for a programmatic analysis due to its very limited scope and subjectivity, nevertheless, its potential for influencing the first two categories should not be ignored. The first two positions are indeed relevant for an attempt at quantifying and qualifying, if that's possible, authenticity, to the extent to which value judgments are intrinsic to the urban context in both its production and perception. The evaluation of the urban context for the purpose of identifying what is urban heritage and what are its values should attempt to examine it through each of these three positions in order to ensure a comprehensive, if not exhaustive, investigation. This means, beside the well-established comparative, typological, and morphological methods of architecture and urban history that represent an objective value judgment, attention should be paid to the more relative value judgments produced by the societies who in fact build and use this particular urban context. These value judgments will be, of course, beyond any typology that can be construed through a cross-cultural comparison and might seem meaningless or difficult to make sense of for professionals unless they are themselves members of that particular society. So on one hand, we have professionals using established typologies elaborated by architecture and urban history, but who are prone to identify only those values of the urban context that they were looking for. As we say, reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design. On the other hand, we have the society that produces and uses the urban context and takes the aforementioned values as identified by specialists as granted, intrinsic, but at the same time have intimate knowledge of the specificity of the urban fabric in a way in which is not possible for an outsider. However, communities encounter difficulty in spelling out these value judgments, although reacting and protesting if what they perceive as valuable were affected by any malign intervention. Yes, I just want to finalize with an interesting situation where the Professor Baldwin Brown, professor at the University of Edinburgh, in his booklet The Care of Ancient Monuments, argues after the collapse of the Venice Campanile di San Marco in 1902 that Venice is still Venice, though the most conspicuous of its monuments has been overthrown, but it will cease to be Venice where all the smaller canals and the network of which gives the place its cachet, filled in and macadamized. Thank you.